Thank you, Anna. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this wonderful gathering and share the stage with some such wonderful people as Astor and Michael. They are rather a tough act to follow, so it makes my job a little more difficult. So good morning, everybody. Here we are, a summit about democracy. I could tell from the program that this is not going to be a celebration of democracy. It's also not going to be a wake. But I think it's about action and positive change, and I think Michael and Astor have kind of set the stage. So it's the work of advocacy. But I'm going to take a bit of a different focus, perhaps a bit of a diversion for just a few minutes, and provide what I would describe as more of a diagnosis. A diagnosis how we as a country view our democracy today. And looking at the perspective of everybody in the country, we have a tremendously large, diverse gathering here. But what about the other 35 million Canadians who couldn't be here? And although I expect that Anna and her team probably would have them here if Ryerson could find a way to accommodate everybody. So what I want to talk about is public opinion and survey research as a way to kind of understand sort of the public mood. It's my profession, it's what I do for a living, to do public opinion research. I do it in a public interest setting for a small nonprofit, and our mission really is to help Canadians understand ourselves better as a people and a country, because we really don't. We really don't understand ourselves quite as well as we might. Perhaps part of that has to do with the fact that we are so distracted by what's happening elsewhere. It's probably more exciting and more entertaining, but not always where the focus ought to be. What I want to do is, make sure I have this, make the case that public opinion research is by no means the truth, but I would argue that it's an important institution of democracy in its own right. It makes an important contribution, and with the caveat that it's done responsibly, in providing a snapshot of who we are, what we think and what we value, unfiltered by personal anecdote in the media and politics. It provides a check against the claims of those who may say from time to time that they speak on behalf of the people. Is it the case or not? And it also provides us with a basis to empathize, with empathy for people who may be different than ourselves. And I think this is more important than ever, given the media silos that we increasingly find ourselves in, to hear from all parts of society, not just the parts that we are most comfortable with. So public opinion matters, and we need to know what it is. And I think, to quote George Gallup, one of the fathers of public opinion research, having chosen a way of life which consults the mass of the people, we must listen to what the people themselves have to say. For public opinion can only be service to democracy if it can be heard. So we need to do the work. And following another quote, which I think talks about the value of survey research, surveys produce just what democracy is supposed to produce, equal representation of all citizens. So I'm not trying to make the case that survey research is all we need for democracy, but it's an important part. So what I want to do over the next few minutes that I have is to present some of the relevant survey research evidence about how Canadians view their democracy and their major democratic institutions, how this is changing over time, and how we compare internationally with other countries. I really can't go into much detail in just a few minutes, and I'll focus just on a few key points. My good colleague Daniel Savas is going to be on the program tomorrow at noon to go into more detail on this, and I suggest you not miss that session. All right, what's some of the evidence? I want to really answer maybe three questions. One is, do Canadians have confidence in their democracy and national institutions? So I just want to give you some examples. This is a question we asked. This survey is from 2017, but it has followed previous surveys to tell us how things are changing. How satisfied are you with the way democracy works in Canada today? A pretty general question. I think if you look at the numbers, you can conclude, as I do, that most Canadians are not particularly enthusiastic about the state of democracy, but at least somewhat, if not very satisfied. Relatively few are strongly dissatisfied. And I think what's important to point out is that the trend over this period of time is fairly stable. This may not be the pattern that we are assuming is taking place. Another question, which is a bit different, is democracy preferable to other forms of government or not? Clear majority of Canadians do believe that, but we can see from this slide that there's been a bit of a softening since 2012, 2014 to 2017. So perhaps there's a bit of a trend starting, and perhaps people are not quite as committed as before. I think this may be picking up a bit on what Astra said earlier this morning, because when we look where the change is happening, it's among Canadians who are under 45 years of age. Those are the ones who perhaps are less committed or convinced that democracy is the best form, and perhaps there's some good reasons for that. What about populism? Here's a question that gets at it a bit obliquely. Agree, disagree, people who should govern directly rather than through elected representatives. We could see on this series of surveys that most Canadians do not clearly agree with this statement, but the proportion who disagree seems to be declining. So there seems to be reduced resistance, I guess, to this notion of so-called populism. And I might point out that this trend is most noticeable among those Canadians who identify on the right of the political spectrum. Perhaps no surprise. On the other hand, and this finding may be a little counterintuitive, agree, disagree. Those who govern this country are interested in what people like you think. Canadians actually are more positive about this now than they were before, a positive trend. And this may be a bit counterintuitive in the sense that we may be assuming that Canadians are becoming less satisfied with this aspect of our democracy and government. What about trust in our national institutions? Data from 2017. A number of institutions, level of trust. We can see that there's a wide variation in the likelihood that people have strong trust. Those like the armed forces, the RCMP, tend to have the most levels of trust. Mass media, political parties, the least so. So there's clearly a gradation here. But I think it's also to point out that if you look at those who say they have little or no trust, so those people that really have a very negative view, is a relatively small proportion, even in the ones near the bottom of the list. It's no more than 1 in 4. So we need to put this into perspective. On another survey, we asked Canadians whether they thought governments that serve them are basically working or broken. The results are no consensus. There's no clear one or the other. More likely than not, Canadians believe that governments are working, although many say working with problems. But I want to point to the group that says it's government's completely broken. It's a relatively small proportion, 13% in 2014 and 8% in 2016. So that's the sort of angry, completely disaffected group, and it's a fairly small group as well. What about changing the electoral system in Canada? We asked a question on a 2016 survey about various changes to the federal electoral system. Voting online, fairly popular. Changing election financing laws, somewhat popular. Changing first past the post, yes, much more support than opposition, but a lot of people don't feel strongly. And making it mandatory to vote in federal elections. I think the takeaway I would take from this slide is that there is definite interest and support for making some changes, but not a particularly strong public demand, not at this point in time. And I think another very important point to keep in mind, particularly in a gathering like this, is that for most Canadians, for most of the time, issues of democracy and governance are not front and center. They're not thinking about it that often. You may see this as a problem, but nevertheless, just to illustrate that fact, from a couple of surveys where we've asked unprompted, what's the most important problem facing Canada today, issues around democracy and governments are not near the top of the list. It is not a top-of-mind salient issue, and we should just keep that in mind as we move forward with what we're trying to accomplish. The second broad topic I want to cover is how opinions about democracy in Canada compare with those in other countries. I think we tend to be in our own bubble, and we may need to focus on this bubble most of the time, but it's useful to provide benchmark comparisons to see how we're doing. Thank you. Here's a question: are you confident or not in your national government? And the data are the yes responses. And this is from the Gallup World Survey from 2005 through 2018. 2018 data just became available recently. And we could see that a clear majority of Canadians, 61% in 2018, say yes, they're confident in their national government. And generally high over this period. The blue line is the OECD average from the 20-some countries that form the OECD. There's quite a difference. The OECD average for 2018 isn't yet available, but I have a table here with a few of the comparative countries. And clearly we could see that Canada, the level of confidence in national government is clearly higher than many other countries we compare ourselves with. Perhaps no surprise, it's half as much in the United States. What about confidence in the honesty of elections? Same data, and we could see that over 70% of Canadians are confident about the honesty of elections in 2018, well above the OECD average and well above many countries in the OECD, comparable to, say, Germany, but well above France and the USA. And finally, confidence in the judicial system and the courts. Again, about 70% of Canadians are confident, and we could see a fairly even trend line, so to speak, and well above many other countries in Europe and the USA. So there's a pattern here, and this may not suggest that we pat ourselves on the back, but put this in context that sometimes what's happening in other countries isn't happening here in quite the same way. From another data source, from the Pew Research Center, you can't read the slide, but I'll tell you basically that if you look at the upper right, there's a small number of countries that score high both on the Economist Democracy Index, which is the x-axis, and a Pew survey question that asks people if they're committed to democracy with elected representation. So Canada, again, it stands out in many ways from many other parts. And most recently, the Edelman Trust Barometer, which many of you may be familiar with, comes out every year. Again, you may not be able to read the details, but the 2019 numbers were released just this past week. Canada isn't at the top, but we are near the top. And I think what's important is the Canadian trust level, overall trust in our institutions, has improved from 2018 to 2019, from the left side to the right side. So certainly, whatever trend we're seeing is trending a bit in the positive direction. The final question I want to address, which is indirectly relevant to democracy, is are Canadians growing more xenophobic? I think this is something the conference organizers suggested may be relevant to this particular conference. So I want to end on this note. Just to show you a few slides. What do Canadians think about immigrants coming to this country? On balance, do they help benefit the country, make it a better place, or make it a worse place? No consensus, but Canadians are much more likely to say that immigrants make the country a better place than a worse place. And I think even more importantly on this slide, it shows that between 2011 and 2018, there's been essentially no change. Despite all of the issues that have happened over the last couple of years with refugees at the border and the politicization and so forth, Canadians' view about immigrants and immigration has remained stable and in some cases actually improved. This is a trend line on a question that Environics has been asking for about 25 years or so. Agree, disagree, too many immigrants do not adopt Canadian values. This is an issue for many Canadians. Many Canadians are uncomfortable with some kinds of immigrants who don't seem to be Canadian enough. And so what we can see is that a majority, more often than not, are concerned or have an issue with this. But if you look at the trend line, it's trending down rather than trending up. This is not becoming more of a concern. It's been lowering itself. And I think speaking to this issue, this slide is, I think, one of the more counterintuitive ones, perhaps, that we have in our research. We asked Canadians what values are most important for immigrants to adopt when they come. And this was an open-ended question, so we didn't give people easy choices. They had to tell us what was in their minds. And this slide basically shows that native-born and immigrant Canadians basically identify the same things that they expect immigrants to adopt: respect for history and culture, language fluency, tolerance for others, respect for the law. It's quite amazing that immigrants share the same view as other Canadians, and I think this is a slide that all Native Canadians in particular should see. And then finally, from Ipsos, a survey they did in 2018, an international ranking of overall inclusiveness based on a number of indicators. We get the gold medal on this one. We are at the top. Doesn't suggest that we're living up to that, but it's, from some respects, in a comparative point of view, we do fairly well. So, what will we take away from this? Well, as others have said already, democracy, as we've come to know it, is certainly challenged in many specific ways, and perhaps here in Canada as well. But here in Canada, we're not seeing the same kind of dramatic or even perceptible loss of public confidence that in democracy and institutions that may be happening elsewhere. I think most Canadians are feeling okay, if not great. I think great was the word perhaps that Astra used, about the state of their democracy and institutions. However, opinions have remained remarkably stable over the past decade or so, despite many of the developments and events that we might have assumed or expected to have really eroded that confidence dramatically. And we've seen that the Canadian public is considerably more confident in broad terms than the publics in many other countries we compare ourselves with. So, here's the question to leave you with. Are Canadians complacent and missing something really important that's going on? Or is this a flag to the rest of us, and we may be missing something because some of us tend to focus on the glass draining rather than the glass filling? And we're missing a picture of, because the predominant narratives in our media and so forth tend to give us a sense that things are falling apart. Well, I don't have an answer to the question, and you probably don't either. But I think it's an important question and something to keep in mind throughout the rest of the conference. And to finish up, I guess what I'd like to say is when the people speak, they're not always right. But if they need to be moved, we first need to know where they are. Have a wonderful conference. Thank you.